Is it even a Halo game if you can't just break out of the map or at least explore little nooks and crannies you're not actually supposed to go into? Well, with Halo Infinite finally releasing the campaign and us now having a grapple hook to make maneuvering even more unique and more interesting than ever before, we decided to take it upon ourselves to try to see what areas we could go and access that maybe weren't necessarily intended for normal players to see or get to. Now, obviously, in this video, we explored various areas from across the campaign, though there won't be any massive story spoilers in this video that you have to worry about. But even if you haven't played through the campaign yet, this might be a video you want to check out just because there's some cool little areas you might want to explore through your regular playthrough, since there isn't a way to replay levels without starting a fresh campaign over just yet. That's coming later on. So explore these little areas while you can on whatever current playthrough you're on. Okay, let's go ahead and take a closer look at what we found in Halo Infinite so far. Okay, I already talked about this in our review, but on the Warship level, the very first mission in Halo Infinite, my very first playthrough, I spent way too much time out of bounds, accidentally, grappling around, getting a feel for it, just trying to explore the area. So coming back to Halo Infinite and just trying this time to purposely explore as much as I could was a really interesting experience. Now, before I had kind of just climbed along the side areas, but this time I decided to go up as high as the game would let me as soon as we get into the area where a bunch of the stuff starts to collapse, I guess. And honestly, this is such a great area just to start to get a feel for the grapple hook and getting to just explore the boundaries. And one thing that is really interesting about Halo Infinite is that in most of these linear levels, you rarely will actually run into one of those soft kill barriers where they just kind of kick you out before you're able to fully explore, which of course is something I like. It just gives that old vibe of being able to have endless possibilities as to what you can actually explore. So I spent a ton of time just walking way up on the highest points of the map, just kind of climbing my way up there and then walking on little beams, little odds and ends. It's interesting when you can kind of stick your head through a texture and see what's on the other side, or just kind of walk alongside some invisible geometry and get to look around. It's definitely nerve-wracking because you feel like at any point you might just fall off the map, and that can be terrifying, but it kind of also is part of the adventure side of things. After kind of walking around these side areas, I wanted to go even higher, so I aimed to try to get up to the ceiling section, and eventually with enough climbing and some risky jumps and grapples, I did manage to climb my way up to the very top, though it may have taken me a couple of tries. I did walk along the long structures that are attached to the ceilings, which kind of are the highest point you could probably stand and walk around on. And it was interesting as I was walking through a tight geometry section where you could walk through some of the textures and continue on. I thought I saw something just very briefly and it caught me off guard. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a ghost at first, or maybe an Easter egg, or maybe actually it kind of made me think it could have been the flood or something, just like randomly appearing up there. I know that was very unlikely, but it just was this very brief second. I was like, what is that? I freaked out a little bit. I tried to recreate it as many times as I could, and occasionally I got it to pop up again, but I couldn't get a good feel for what it was. But then when I kind of turned around and rotated backwards and got a wider view of what was going on, it was actually just some of the debris that comes out of the ceiling when everything's exploding. It looks like this is one of the spawn points for it, and it just kind of shoots out of here periodically, and it's just like this red stuff that comes out. I don't know, it's interesting nonetheless though to get a closer look at that. Now this one's not as much of a grappling hiding spot, but it is earlier on in this level, and it's something that the speedrunning community has already kind of started looking into, and it's really cool. Now typically when you play through this level, you run through a bunch of hallways, and then you get to the big engineering room where you have to overload some thrusters, and there's a ton of enemies. You have to clear all the enemies out. But before you even get up to that area, if you go into the room over here and punch this specific door 3 times, for whatever reason, the door just opens up. Now you may notice nothing is textured, but when you step through the door, the entire hallway will then load in, and you can run all the way to where the big engine room is. This is actually the exit route you take when you leave the engine room, although all the lights are turned off when you're running this way. And once you get to the door that takes you into the engine room, the loading sequence that typically starts when you finish the engine room is triggered, and you can bypass everything in the engine room and just run back the way that you just came to make your exit. But this time all the lights will turn on, all the enemies spawn in, and all the explosions and stuff happen. But it is a super interesting shortcut, and it's just cool to see some of those older odds and ends loading tricks pop up in such a new Halo game. Definitely feels like a game still made in that classic sequential loading style. On the next level, you have your very first boss fight, and at the end of the level, there's an elevator you're supposed to take up to the top, and I decided to take it upon myself to try to skip this whole last section of the level, or just see if I can take a shortcut and avoid using the elevator altogether, using the grapple hook to climb. Now, in the first two levels, you can't upgrade your grapple hook at all, so you have to just use the default recharge and stuff, which makes climbing upwards way harder than what I'm able to do in the rest of the levels. But after a while, I did get a feel for how I had to kind of pull the Spartan backwards away from the upwards pull so that I would get the most upwards momentum, but also be able to rehook on at a higher angle than where I'm actually close to. It sounds complicated, but once you get a vibe for it, you can get into the rhythm of just climbing up and making upwards speed with this default grapple hook. And I climbed, and I climbed, and I climbed, and right when I thought I was getting close to the top, because there was this black ceiling, and I hit my head on an invisible barrier that blocks you right here at the top point of the elevator. It was a little disappointing, but still, it was really fun to get a feel for climbing the elevator shaft that you're not supposed to go up. It was kind of cool. On the conservatory, I did manage to try to climb up as high as I could in this section to just see if I could maybe get a look outside of those windows. Now, this area was really great for practicing grappling and just using the grapple hook to get a lot of forward momentum. It's a big open space that's a lot of fun to climb up in. However, the really disappointing part was, as badly as I wanted to see what was outside those windows, pretty obvious that they didn't intend on anyone even going up in this section. I did eventually hit my head on an invisible ceiling like 70% of the way up to the top of the room. So unfortunately, we won't get a closer look at that window just yet, but still, it was kind of cool to get a good look of this area from a very high angle and then just get to free fall back down. Now, later on the Spire, I pretty much did the exact opposite of what I got to do in the conservatory, where instead in this instance, we ride a grav lift up, and I decided to try to use my grapple hook to fling myself back down the grav lift. And surprisingly enough, this was actually somewhat effective, where the pull of the grapple hook is stronger than the push of a grav lift. So I was able to kind of force my way back down the grav lift quite a bit. Now, you do get a little glimpse of a room area down here. However, it does look like there's hard barriers stopping you from traveling outside of the cylinder of the grav lift. So as much as I wanted to pull myself into those rooms, I could only grapple hook them to pull myself further down, not actually to yank myself out of the grav lift. And I was able to descend all the way down into this large room. And overall, this whole area was actually really cool looking. There wasn't too much to it, but it still was cool just that there was this area that most players won't even really look at other than just a few seconds they're going up the grav lift, that I was able to take a slower moment and enjoy the sights of a little bit longer. Also, in general, on the Spire, this level has some really high ceilings, so you can kind of grapple your way up and just skip some sections or skip some enemies by just chilling up on these upper areas. There's not really too much of a point to it, but I did think it was fun getting up this high. And then later on in the level, you get to this big, large, wide open room, and usually you have to wait a few seconds before the light bridge comes out, and I was like, nah, I'm just gonna grapple my way around the room and see what happens. I ended up just grappling onto the side of this large square room, and eventually could make my way up even to the ceiling to grapple up there if I wanted to, or just stay alongside the side walls. I definitely died quite a few times messing around in this room and trying to get a feel for how much I could explore, but I was pleasantly surprised to find that I could pretty much go to any area in this section of the map that I wanted to. Firstly, I wanted to go check out those large gold windows that have the light just pouring in from it. It just looks so cool, and I was able to grapple over there. There's not too much going on in here, but it is a cool room to say that you're able to get inside of. But after chilling in this area for a little bit, I grappled back into the middle of the room, and real quick, I wanted to see if I could climb up the elevator shaft here early before triggering the button, and unfortunately, you can't. There's a hard barrier plugging this up at the top, but it is funny, as soon as you drop down and press the button, you just go right back up the elevator. But by far, one of my favorite ones that I discovered in my playthrough of just exploring odds and ends of Halo Infinite was the level Nexus. Now, typically in this level, there's this long gondola ride that you go on, and it kind of takes you through this big door that opens up, kind of reminds you of Halo 2 a little bit, and then you just carry on after you get off the gondola. But I was just wondering, since I've now kind of managed to get a really good feel on grappling alongside walls and continuously grappling for a long time, what if we took that to the next level and try to skip the gondola altogether? And actually, this was a bit of a bigger process than maybe I initially thought it would be. It started off with me just trying to get a feel for grappling around the room and seeing if there was invisible barriers, which at first I actually thought there was, but I ended up getting past it, so there wasn't. But in general, having to grapple continuously for a very long time without having a landing point is pretty challenging. And in this wide open room, I did struggle a bit until I started to get a feel for it. I did find occasionally little sentinel entrance areas or spawn holes in the wall, I don't know what to call these things, that I could stand on and get a better feel for the room. But eventually, this would be a section that I would have to grapple continuously through if I was going to actually make my way alongside it. So as I was just grappling ahead to where the big door was, I wanted to see if I could actually stand on the door that opens up, and while it seemed like I was kind of clipping through the door, I made my way back around, only to find the door actually opened up when my character got close enough to the door. So then began the whole process of trying to grapple my way back to go through the door, which if you actually go too low, you'll end up dying because there's a kill barrier about halfway through the door. And I tried to grapple through that and get to the other side, which was, oddly enough, a pretty good success. But then I knew I had to try to make my way all the way over to where the gondola typically stops. So the grapple game continued. It was really, really challenging because the ceilings actually change in height periodically as you progress section to section, which ends up making it a lot easier to slip up and overestimate how far your grapple can actually go. And then you have those heartbreaking deaths. And I died a lot here just trying to get a feeling for what I was able to do in this area. But eventually, sure enough, I did manage to continuously keep a grapple going and work my way alongside those ceilings before I finally landed and touched down on the next bridge section where the gondola typically lands. And interestingly enough, when I landed there, I was given the cue to progress the level normally, so I just continued as if I had gotten off the gondola, even though I'd never rode the gondola to begin with. And right after that room, we're greeted to another massive room that I spent a ton of time exploring. Besides the fact I love the way that they scaled these larger than life structures in Halo Infinite, almost respecting Halo Combat Evolved's architecture and then things that are introduced later on in Halo 2. I love the fact I can just go explore areas I'm clearly not supposed to go, and I began my work grappling alongside the walls, just bypassing this whole section that I'm supposed to be in, and I decided to go all the way down to the left of this large enclosed space. And while it was tricky to maneuver through this, and there's not very many things you can stand on to try to catch your breath and get a checkpoint or something like that, eventually I did make my way all the way to the end wall, and there's this little lookout window that's here that is likely just for aesthetics, so when you look both directions on the bridge, you can not only see something in the distance, but it actually is placed only on one side of this area and not both sides, likely to make the area asymmetrical, so if you get spun around or something happens like that, you don't get confused which direction you're going. You can remember that there was a light on the left side, not on the right side. It is actually a really small detail that I think was really cleverly made, though I so badly wanted to get into this little balcony room, and I just could not get in there for the life of me. But hey, it's cool that it still exists. Then I decided to grapple my way all the way back, then begin my grappling challenge to the opposite side, and of course there's no little balcony window lookout area over there, and it actually is just a curved wall, and that threw me off so badly because I kept feeling like I needed to continue on, but I was so focused on keeping the grapple going that I never really realized that I was turning with the wall and I would get turned around and I would see the bridge in front of me and think that I spun myself around, but it really was just me following the wall. It's confusing, but still, it was a cool big open area to explore. Now, one interesting thing is right after all of that, when I decided to progress in the level, my game soft locked, hard locked. I'm not really sure what to call this. So I had full reign to look around and move, so my game wasn't completely frozen, but nothing else worked at all. And I was just stuck like that infinitely. So I ended up having to restart the game. And when I restarted the game and loaded in, it didn't give me any of my checkpoints from when I was just grappling around and exploring. It put me all the way back to the beginning section of the gondola. From there, I rode the gondola normally, and that seemed to fix the problem. So I think somehow, while some loading parts still work normally, if you decide to leave the gondola behind and not play the game sequentially like you're supposed to, you might run into a problem like this, where the game ends up locking itself. Okay, on Nexus, there's also this tunnel slide thing that you get to slide down, which definitely is a cool throwback, I think, to Halo 2. But not only is it fun just to free fall and ride down the slide, I'm sure many of us took it upon ourselves to try to climb our way back up the drop down. And of course, that was immediately what I wanted to try to do. I climbed up the entire thing, and about midway up the climb, you actually realize there's a fork in the road, despite it being really dark and you're grappling your way up and you can't really see where you're going. If you go back up the normal way that you fell down, you can make your way all the way back up to the room you started in, and then you can do the whole slide again, though no Easter egg or anything cool happens. And then if you grapple your way back up and take the dark path going up where the fork is, you can continue to climb up for a little ways before you hit a ceiling that blocks you from going any further. Also, there's this big entrance way that you go into by rising up a grav lift here, and I wanted to explore the structure of it, even though I knew there probably wouldn't be too much I could go and actually see. But it still was fun swinging around the outside area of this and just looking at this entrance way that's used in a vertical format. It's just something that's kind of neat to look at. Even though you can't just bring yourself to the end of the level using the grapple hook, you have to actually ride up the lift itself. There's also a few other spots from Infinite's campaign that I found interesting, even if I couldn't really go too far out of bounds on them. Like on Repository, for instance, there's this large elevator shaft that you go up, and I wanted to see how high up I could climb. And this time around, it was a little different than some of the other structures we've run into where we get blocked off by a hard barrier. There actually wasn't a barrier stopping us from climbing higher. It was just a trait zone preventing me from using my grapple hook after I hit a certain height in the level. So that was just interesting because it was different from anything else where typically we would hit a barrier. In this case, I just couldn't grapple hook. The ability was just turned off or whatever. And then on the final level, there's a couple of sections that are a little bit interesting to fly around and grapple upon. There's this big wide open blue room, which is kind of like one of the areas we saw earlier on, and you can kind of grapple around a bit. There is, interestingly enough, an invisible ceiling not letting you get too high, and if you go too far this way, we have a soft kill barrier, which isn't something we see too often in the linear campaign levels. Though once again, if you go all the way out to the side, it looks like there is, in one of these instances, one of those balcony type areas, and it may actually be accessible. There are a lot of sections in this level where you do stand in a window kind of looking off without going into spoilers. So it is cool that in this one you might actually get to go inside them, but it is interesting to see how the use of this space is different in this level this time around. Also, at the very end, before you go to the final boss fight, there is an elevator ride that you typically ride and some cutscene stuff goes down, and I decided to try to grapple my way up to the top to see if it would let me go up there, and actually this time around there wasn't a barrier stopping me from climbing all the way up this blue elevator. It looks cool with the blue rings or whatever, and once I got to the top, I realized you can't progress unless you get the elevator. So you have to jump back down, and you have to take the elevator to get that last door to open. So they're still kind of stuck, but it was fun getting to make my way up an elevator shaft that actually led to something. Okay, now while I was working on trying to find some interesting places to navigate in the more linear sections, and Luke was grinding his way at getting this video edited, we decided to send Dim off on his own little task to just go out in the open world and see what happens. Now mind you, this footage is Dim rocking the Xbox from 2013, which is his preferred console of choice. But Dim did manage to find out that if you navigate over to this section of the map, you can kind of go down into some rocks, and there's kind of just a clear area you can use with the Wasp and get out of bounds. Essentially, you get full access to the complete underbelly of this area, and while you can't fully go anywhere you want without running into a soft kill barrier, it's still really interesting to see the Halo ring from this type of perspective. And besides Dim randomly blowing up out of nowhere, he was really excited to report back to us that he did manage to kill a single grunt through the bottom of the map, shooting through the surface. So that was kind of cool. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for all that Halo Infinite has to offer as far as little explorative areas that aren't intentional for players to find. Obviously, there's the Easter eggs that are put there, like the Easter egg, spoiler alert, giant sandwich hidden in the caves, or the Craig tour on top of the tower. But I think finding some of the areas that maybe aren't as black and white intentional are just as cool too. So did you guys find anything interesting that caught your eye, or did you try any of these ones when you were playing through before this video even went out? Let us know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Make sure you follow Luke and I, by the way, on Twitter at Rocket Elijah for me, or at Rocket Sloth Luke for Luke, so you can see the nonsense we tweet out. Also, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss a video. But otherwise, that's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.